All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this DAP Learning Series Tag Managers Part 2 Configuration Framework. This is a follow-up to the Part 1 that I offered last month on the data layer. I think Freddie's going to be mentioning that and providing a link in the slides as well. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tim Loudon. I'm the Program Manager for the Digital Analytics Program. I'm joined today by my partner in crime, the phenomenal Freddie Blicher, who's going to talk today about how you should think about setting up a tag management system. Very quick notes before we get started. This session is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube analytics playlist a few days after this ends, in case you need to refer back to it. Please put any questions in the chat field, and if we have time, we'll be addressing them at the end of the webinar. And other than that, and of course, afterward, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a survey about what asking you what you thought about this training. Please fill out the survey. It really helps us a lot. We do look at all the responses. It's anonymous if you want it to be, but we would appreciate it. Okay, with that, Freddie's got a ton of content to deliver to you today, so I will pass it over to Freddie.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Hey, folks. Just want to say thank you to the Digitalgov team. They're always very helpful in helping the DAP team out with these webinars. And thank you to Tim for his feedback on this webinar. We've got a lot of material to get through, so I am going to jump right in. So welcome to DAP Learning Series Tag Managers Part 2 Configuration Framework. This is going to be a bit of a doozy. There's a lot of material here, so I hope folks are ready. Let me just kind of jump in. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to talk about a brief recap of tag manager systems, which we call TMSs. So we'll be using that acronym throughout today's presentation. We're going to be talking about data layer variables, triggers, and tags. We're going to be going over a three-path configuration framework and best practices on when to configure all of these things. And then we're going to look at some examples, and then we're going to do a Q&A. Hopefully, if we have some time at the end, we've got about 64 slides to get through, so we have a ton of material here. So I'm going to dive right in. So this hour is designed to be conceptual rather than technical. Tim mentioned this on the last webinar. This is also true of this webinar. So, different tools have different ways of implementing processes that I'm talking about today. Also, as Tim noted last time, I am also not a developer. So if I have something incorrect, please feel free to tell me. So how to get the value out of today's webinar? Let's talk a little bit about this. This is a very advanced topic. So I would say at a minimum, you need an intermediate level in Google Analytics. You need some experience with a TMS, a tag manager system, data layer variables, triggers, and tags, and you really need to know your goals and KPIs. So this is a lot. So if you're new to Google Analytics and tag manager systems, you'll get more value out of learning the basics first with DAP's two webinars, DAP 101 and DAP 201. We highly encourage folks, if you're new, check those out. This won't make sense today, but if you get a basic understanding, this will make sense later on. Okay, so why are we here today? So using a TMS can feel like you're figuring out what came first, the chicken or the egg. So we've got Homer there with a little chicken playing checkers. So figuring out the when and how to implement a TMS is challenging, but that really is half the battle, okay? So our goal today is to help you demystify this, so that you can hopefully come away with some better understanding and insight on how to use and configure a TMS. This is going to be talking about the thought process. How you think about this stuff is the most important part of this process before you configure anything in any type of TMS. So what makes this challenging is how you implement a TMS is entirely specific to your website. This means the technology, the code, the content management system that you're using. Every website has different developers, different approaches, different CMS platforms like WordPress or Drupal. This all means different code, different elements, different data layers. This is why every instance of a TMS needs to be custom built to your specific website. So let's do a quick recap of tag managers. So tag manager systems, which we're referring to as TMS, allow you to deploy scripts, trigger actions, and store data for use in a central place without touching your page's source code, okay? Why should we be using tag managers? Well, tag managers really help you track interactions by your audience at scale. So for example, if you have 10,000 PDFs, you do not want to be hand coding event tracking for all 10,000 PDFs. You want to use a TMS, a tag manager system, to track those PDF downloads at scale so that you can better, more effectively track your PDF download conversion rate. So tag managers really help you get really customized with what you want to track, and they help you track at scale. So the beauty of this approach is it lessens the burden on your development team. So once you get a tag manager running, you then own the logic and the business rules for making it fire and what types of interactions you want to track. So to give you a brief recap of what Tim presented in part one, this is what a tag manager does. So a tag manager is simply a piece of code that your developer puts into your HTML that has the tag manager container in it. Within the tag manager container, you manage all of your different tracking tools. You could have Google Analytics or jQuery, different scripts like heat mapping tools, A/B testing tools, surveys, feedback tools, different ad tools, and you manage all of those in the tag manager container, okay? Now, what's required of this? You really need to know your website mission, your goals, and your KPIs, otherwise known as key performance indicators. This is something that the DAP team drives home in every webinar and every engagement we have with a different agency. This is the secret sauce, if you will. This is how you unlock the insights from your data, knowing your website mission, goals, and KPIs. So you do know your mission, goals, and KPIs, right? If you don't, this webinar is going to be very difficult to conceptualize why you would want to track specific interactions. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You need to define website mission, goals, and KPIs. So we're going to give a little plug for our previous webinar, Tag Managers Part 1. You really need to have gone through that webinar for this webinar to make any sense. So we highly encourage you, check out Tag Managers Part 1. Now, in part 1 of the webinar, of this webinar series, Tim did a great job of explaining all you need to know about the data layer. So again, you need to check out DAP's part 1 of this webinar series for any of this to make sense. Knowing about the data layer is a foundational concept to what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you haven't done part 1, this is likely not going to make a whole lot of sense. So I want to first unpack some terminology and break down some of these terms for folks on today's webinar. So let's talk about the data layer and just define these broadly. So data layer is an invisible layer into which your developer or your content management system plugins or Google Tag Manager can push or reference information about different user interactions, or it can trigger some piece of data to be collected and sent to Google Analytics. So in the previous webinar, Tim described it as the data layer is an invisible place where you can send and temporarily store data that your tag manager can use. The tag manager can send it to applications or use it to trigger other things. Now, an important thing to note, not every website has a data layer. So your mileage is going to vary depending on the type of website CMS that you're using and how your developers have implemented your website. That's what makes this challenging. Now, what makes this even more challenging is that sometimes developers often aren't familiar with the data layer. So what this does is this leaves you to be the person who needs to understand what the data layer is so that you can speak intelligently to your developers or to whoever's managing the content system or to whoever's managing Google Tag Manager or any TMS that you might use at your agency. Let's talk about a tag. A tag is simply tracking code you implement on your site. So these could be things like the Google Analytics event tag or a Facebook pixel tag or a Google Ads conversion tag. A tag tells you the what. What do you want your TMS to do? talk about a trigger. A trigger are rules you define for when your tags fire. So for example, if you fire an event tag when a user clicks a button, or if you fire an event tag when a user scrolls down 75% of the page, all right? Triggers are the rules that help determine when something fires to capture a certain piece of data. So a trigger tells, this is the when. So when do you want to track some interaction using a tag? Now, triggers aren't just used for sending data to Google Analytics. They can be used to do things, to make things, other things happen, like firing a survey or updating the metadata on a page. There's a lot of different use cases here for triggers. Let's define variables. So variables are information you can use in tags or triggers. They tell you the what, the when, or the how. Now, these are multi-purpose. This makes this very complicated to distill this down into an easily understandable kind of approach, but they are multi-purpose and they help make triggers more specific. So, for example, what this means is you could use a variable to specify a particular URL. So let's say you wanted to specify that a tag only fires on the confirmation page. You could specify a variable that says only fire on slash confirmation, so that your tag only fires on that confirmation page. You could also use a variable to determine which Google Analytics account, which UAID you want to send data to. Or you could use a variable to capture purchase order revenue, for example. So let's talk about how should we be thinking about configuring our TMS. How do we even start this? Okay. I'm sure for folks on the webinar, you've likely logged into your TMS and you've wondered, how do I even approach this thing? It feels like a situation where you don't know whether it's the chicken or the egg. Where do I begin? How do we even start? So when we first approach a TMS, we need to be thinking about what's the process, what's the thought process of deciding how to get data into the data layer, into your TMS or Google Tag Manager, and then into Google Analytics or whichever analytics platform you use. What does that mental model look like? All right, this is where it's going to get really conceptual in this webinar. So the mental model, the goal of our mental model needs to be, we need to get data into the data layer about certain user interactions. And how we're going to do that is we're either going to use what's called a standard auto event listener, a custom auto event listener, or use our developer or a content management system plugin. So what this means is once you have the data available in the data layer from one of these methods, then you can configure your TMS to read that data, capture that data, send that data to Google Analytics or whatever analytics platform that you use. So which each method, the standard auto event listener, the custom auto event listener, and then the developer/CMS plugin method, each method depends on the particular situation of your website. That's what makes this difficult. All right. So you need to know what specifically you're trying to track and why. And that's why your goals and KPIs are so important in this discussion. So once you have the data available in the data layer, then you can configure your TMS. And then you're able to read data with variables, define your trigger logic, and then create a tag. So for example, for folks on this webinar, if you've ever done anything with tracking outbound link clicks or PDF downloads or video plays, login status, scroll depth, that's what we're looking to track here. And these are the types of user interactions we're trying to figure out. How do we think about what do we need to use? A standard auto event listener, a custom auto event listener, or a developer/CMS plugin. So here is our mental model. Here is a practical framework for how you need to think about configuring your TMS. So our framework here is 3 paths, 5 steps. Now, if you look at the orange arrow going from left to right, as you go to the right, from left to right, it gets more difficult. Now, underneath the orange arrow, you have 3 paths. You have number 1, auto event listener. This is the easiest. You have number 2, custom auto event listener. This is definitely more challenging. And then you have number 3, using your developer or a CMS plugin. This is challenging. So for most folks on the webinar, path 1 might meet most people's needs for configuring your TMS. Okay, so path 1 is the path of least resistance. So our guidance to you is when you're trying to figure out how to set up Google Tag Manager or any type of TMS, you want to be thinking in terms of what is the path of least resistance? How can I set this up in an elegant, efficient way to get the data that we need? You need to choose your path wisely. So let's walk through kind of each of the 3 paths and talk through the 5 steps in each of those and just kind of walk through the process here. So let's start with path 1, auto event listener. So underneath the green box with auto event listener, we have 5 different steps. So when we're thinking and looking at different data, we're going to be focusing on path 1, and we're going to go through the steps in order to figure out what is possible and what's not possible. So how you do this is you look at step 1 is the interaction track with an auto event listener. Okay. If it's not, you go to step 2, you enable one trigger to see if you have an auto event listener that is tracked. Then step 3, you enable an out of the box variable. Step 4, you configure your trigger. And then step 5, you configure your tag and link to the trigger, and then capture the data set and send it to your analytics tool. Now, let's say you get to step 2 and you're not able to enable one trigger with an out of the box auto event listener. You can't continue on to step 3. So you then need to go to path 2, which is in blue. This is the custom auto event listener. And then we go down through the 5 different steps again. They're slightly modified to account for how custom auto event listeners need to be configured. But this is the thought process you need to follow when determining what is possible and what is not possible. So again, step 1, we're going to try and implement a custom auto event listener. Step 2, we're going to test out that interaction in our GTM debug mode to see if that custom auto event listener is actually appearing. Then we're going to create a data layer variable in step 3, and then we're going to configure a trigger in step 4, and then configure your tag and link to the trigger in step 5. Now, if you go through path 2 and you hit step 2 and you're not able to see any interaction in your debug mode for this custom auto event listener, you then cannot move past step 2, and you have to go to path 3, where there are now 5 different steps. So you need to talk to your developer. This is arguably the most complicated one, because your developer is their skill sets, their awareness of the data layer is going to vary. So you're going to have to talk to your developer or use a content management system plugin to send data to the data layer so that you can complete your 5 steps, configure your TMS, and send data to the data layer, capture it, and then send it to your analytics platform. So this is kind of how it works. There's a lot going on here. So you really need to be thinking about this, number 1, so that you're able to choose your path wisely. That's key in this. And so we're going to try and demystify this a little bit more for you in the next couple of slides. So let's talk about path 1 and auto event listeners. So what is an auto event listener? All right, these are simply functions that are out of the box in your TMS that are created to track certain user interactions. So when these auto event listeners spot a particular type of interaction, you can see it and its data in the debug mode of Google Tag Manager. Now, for the purposes of our examples today, I'm going to be using GTM, so Google Tag Manager. So I'll be referencing GTM in certain cases and TMS in others. All right. Now, you need to enable triggers in GTM to enable auto event listeners. So this is where step 2 comes in. Remember, step 2 is a critical step. If you can't get past step 2 in path 1, you then have to go to path 2, where you then have to create a custom auto event listener. So what types of things can you track with auto event listeners? Well, a good example are PDF files, Excel files, outbound link clicks. There's a lot of interesting things that you can use from path one. Now, again, path one is going to be your path of least resistance. Always start with path one when you're trying to figure out what is possible to be tracked in GTM or your TMS. Now, let's look at these out-of-the-box triggers in GTM specifically. So if you use another TMS, this may look slightly different, but the concepts are the same. So we're trying to communicate with real-world examples using GTM now, all right? So now you'll see on the left-hand side, we've got different triggers in Google Tag Manager. I'm in the trigger section, and these are all the out-of-the-box trigger types that we can enable to the auto event listeners with, okay? So today's examples, we're gonna be using GTM screenshots. I do wanna make a quick note. The debug tool in Google Tag Manager sometimes stops working. So we don't have enough time to toggle back and forth in this 1 hour to troubleshoot why the debug tool in Google Tag Manager doesn't work. So what we're doing is we've screenshotted the whole process. So hopefully that makes it easier for folks to reference at home when you get this deck, okay? So let's look at an example of an auto event listener. Now on the right-hand side is a page on fedramp.gov. So in the green box that I've highlighted is a link to a PDF file, vulnerability scanning requirements for containers document. So let's say we want to track the number of PDF downloads of the document on this page. That's our example. That's our use case. So we need to start with our practical framework and look at our 3 paths, 5 steps mental model. Now, we just went over this earlier, so we're just going to literally go through all the steps in path 1. So we're going to look, I'm not going to repeat all 5 steps here. You can just kind of reference this kind of flow here. We're just going to go through steps 1 through 5 and see if path 1 gets us where we need to be. So let's look at each of these individual steps. So path 1, step 1. So the first thing, when we look at that FedRAMP page and we click on a PDF, we need to look in our Google Tag Manager debug mode. So this is looking at the preview and debug mode, and we need to be looking at is the interaction with that PDF file tracked with an auto event listener in debug mode? And what we see is we click the PDF and we don't see that we have link clicks enabled in this green box here, right? So what that means is nothing is firing in the data layer for that PDF download, for that link click. So we then have to go on to step 2 of path 1. So we need to determine which out of the box auto event listener we need to enable to see that link click for the PDF in the data layer. So in Google Tag Manager, I'm going to go to triggers, and then I'm going to look at those kind of default out of the box triggers, and I'm going to choose just links. This is a common one for folks who are more experienced with Google Tag Manager. For any type of link that you're trying to track, you would choose just links. Now, step 2 continued. I'm going to go back to, after I've chosen just links and enabled that trigger, I'm now going to refresh my debug mode. I'm going to go back to my FedRAMP page in the PDF. I'm going to click on that PDF, and then I'm going to look back at my debug mode in Google Tag Manager. And now I see the link click in this green box firing in the data layer. So this is now being captured in the data layer. That's what we want. Now, step 3, enable the out-of-the-box variables. So now in Google Tag Manager, I'm going to go back in, I'm going to go to variables, and I'm going to choose these out-of-the-box variables. So I'm going to choose all the click variables. So we've got click element all the way down to click text. Step 3 continued. I'm going to go back to my GTM debug mode tool. And I'm going to QA the FedRAMP page where I had the PDF click. Now, when I click on that PDF in my GTM debug mode, I look in the data layer and I see these variables that I just enabled now firing. This is what we need to do in step 3, enable these out-of-the-box variables. Okay, so path 1, step 4, update your trigger. So now I'm going to go into GTM, I'm going to go to the trigger section, and I'm going to update my just links trigger that I set up before. I'm going to specify some link clicks here in green, and then I'm going to select the different file types, .pdf, .docx, .xls. So that's going to pick up the fact that I'm clicking on a PDF, which is what we're trying to track on that FedRAMP page. So path 1, step 5 is create your tag. And so what I'm doing here is I'm creating a Google Analytics Universal Analytics tag, event tag, and I am specifying an event category of downloads, an event action of the click URL, which was the variable that I implemented earlier. So that's going to show me the actual URL of the PDF file. And then I'm pulling in the event label. I'm defining the event label as page URL. So this is going to show me the page where that PDF was clicked on. Okay. And then I'm going to go back to my GTM debug mode, reload the FedRAMP web page, click on the PDF, download the PDF, and look in my GTM debug mode. And here we see that link click. And now we see the Google Analytics event document link click tag fired for the PDF download. So this completes path 1. This is the thought process for how you need to configure auto event listeners for this type of interaction, specifically for PDF downloads. Okay. Now, let's talk about path 2. This is the custom auto event listener path. Okay, this is where it gets more challenging. Remember the orange arrow from left to right? From left, it's easy, and the further you go right to the right on the orange with the orange arrow, it gets more difficult. We're now kind of in the middle, so we're with path 2, custom auto event listener. So what is a custom auto event listener? Well, this is a similar concept to an event listener, an auto event listener. The only thing is it has to be custom configured. So you need to enable custom event listeners using custom HTML tags. A custom listener adds data about the user interaction into the data layer, and then you access that data with data layer variables. That's a mouthful. This is tough stuff. So if you're a little bit lost, that's okay. You know, you're not going to be an expert after today's webinar, but we're going to try and at least demystify the thought process that is so foundational to how you need to think about this. All right. So an example of a situation where you may need to implement a custom event, auto event listener is, let's say you have a very specific type of Vimeo video embedded on your website. So Vimeo is a video platform like YouTube, except they have their own technology. Now, this is not the only type of scenario where you may need a custom auto event listener. You know, there may be other technology platforms like HubSpot or other services that you need to make custom code to capture and listen to interactions of your audience with those specific pieces of technology. So this is what we're doing with custom auto event listeners. So let's look at an example of a custom auto event listener. So we need to be thinking about, okay, we need to get our data into the data layer. So first things first, we need to see if path 1 applies to this scenario. Okay, so the example here is we're going to be looking at, okay, we want to track interactions with an embedded Vimeo video on a web page. Now, as part of path 1, we need to go look in our triggers at the out-of-the-box trigger types that we have here. And we need to be looking to see if there's anything for Vimeo. Now, I'm going to be looking through these trigger types when I'm in Google Tag Manager. I'm going through them and, oh, I see YouTube video, but I don't see Vimeo video. I go over to other, I don't see anything there. So there is no Vimeo trigger type here. So what this means is we cannot use auto event listeners in our TMS. So we go through this process of path 1, and we determine that we cannot pass step 2 in path 1, which means we need to go to path 2 now, okay, which is more difficult. Now, we're going to go through the next 5 steps to talk about how you need to configure your TMS using custom auto event listeners. So, best thing any of us can always do when we have questions about any type of custom auto event listener is Google it. So I Googled, and I'm gonna, for the sake of brevity, I'm not gonna go through the whole process here of the code that I found for Vimeo, but I found a Vimeo custom event listener code on Google. And in step 1, I'm going to now implement the custom auto event listener using a custom HTML tag. So again, think of the chart, the 3-path, 5-step chart that I had earlier. We're now going into step 1 of the custom auto event listener path. Now I'm going to implement this custom HTML tag. I've pasted in my custom code for Vimeo. Okay, so we're going to be creating the listener now because we don't have one out of the box. So we are then forced to create a custom auto event listener using a custom HTML tag. Now, as part of creating a custom HTML tag, you are required to choose a trigger. So I'm choosing DOM ready. Okay. Now there are also situations where you may want to use window loaded, but all to say, you know, the point here is that we need to find a way to trigger this custom HTML, this custom auto event listener when an element of the Vimeo video player is available on the page. It needs to be listening for this Vimeo embedded video player in your HTML. So that's what we're doing with this custom HTML tag, which contains the code for the custom auto event listener. Okay, so continuing with step 2, we're now going to test out our custom auto event listener by clicking play on the Vimeo video that's embedded in my HTML. And we're going to look at our GTM, our TMS's preview and debug mode to see what is captured in the data layer. And we see here, after implementing our custom auto event listener, GTM is now acknowledging and seeing that a video engagement, a video interaction took place. And you'll see that here in this green box. Now, continuing step 2, we then look into our data layer with this Vimeo video interaction, and we see the custom HTML that we set up, the custom auto event listener, is capturing some really interesting data here. We've got an event category of Vimeo, an event action of Vimeo play, and then an event label. This has a title of this Vimeo, Learning Vimeo, Basic Embed Customization for Sharing Videos. So this is very important to us for the data layer, okay? So watch what we need to do next as part of step 3 in this 3-path, 5-step process. Step 3 is we now have to create our variables. So here we're going to create data layer variables for event action and event label, which we referenced before in this green box, event action, which is Vimeo play, and event label, which is the title. So we're going to create variables that pull in whatever dynamic value is going to be thrown for event action in the data layer and event label for the data layer. So this could be play or pause, and this could be the title of the video. Now we're going to go refresh our Google Tag Manager screen. We're going to go back to the page with the embedded Vimeo video. We're going to click play on the video, and in our debug tool in Google Tag Manager, we're going to look at the debug mode to see that the variables are working, to make sure that they contain values. And in green here is the screen that I saw when I QA'd and when I looked at the Vimeo video player interaction in debug mode. So we see here are my specific data layer variables event action. It says Vimeo play, and this is the custom auto event listener helping us get data about this interaction so that we can capture it using variables. So we see this Vimeo play, and then we see the event label, which is the title of the video. So this confirms to us that we are successfully tracking this data with our variables. Those variables are capturing or holding that data for us. Now, step 4 of our 3-path framework is we now need to configure triggers for custom events for whenever a Vimeo data layer push occurs on the page. So what we need to do is we need to look at the data layer section of our GTM, our Google Tag Manager debug mode. Now we see the event here, video. The event here has a value of video. And so what we now need to do is create a trigger that uses this value video, right? This is going to be our business logic so that when this value video is thrown with this parameter event, our trigger is going to see that in the data layer and then tell another tag to fire about that interaction. So that's what this custom event tag does, referencing video in our data layer. And this is going to do it for all custom events using with this specific video tag. So if we had 5,000 Vimeo videos installed on our website, it would do it for all 5,000. Okay, so that's where you get unlock the power to scale this type of tracking. All right, so now step 5 in our 3-path diagram is we need to configure your tag and link to the trigger. So in GTM, we're going to choose tags, and then I'm going to create an event tag that's going to throw a value of video. And then I'm going to reference under the event action, my data layer variable, my custom variable event action, which is going to have a value like Vimeo play or Vimeo pause. And then I'm going to have the data layer, and then I'm going to have the event label, which is going to reference the data layer variable event label, which is going to be the title of the Vimeo video. So it's the action and the label are going to dynamically pull in whatever dynamic values are being thrown in the data layer for the Vimeo video. And this is what enables us to track automatically 5,000 Vimeo videos with different titles, different interaction types, okay? So that's path 5. So after we do that, we now have to test everything in debug mode in our TMS. So what I'm gonna do in GTM is I'm gonna reload my GTM, refresh it, and then I'm gonna look at the HTML page that includes the embedded video, Vimeo video. I'm gonna click play. And then I'm going to look in my Google Tag Manager debug mode. And here's video that fires this video event. And in debug mode, I see that my tag, my Google Analytics event tag for this Vimeo video interaction has successfully fired. So I've successfully gone through all 5 steps of path 2. And I have now confirmed that my tag fires and is configured using best practices for this specific Vimeo video interaction. So that's really exciting. Now, the 3rd path, let's talk a little bit about this. This is obviously going to be the most challenging because this is the data layer /CMS plugin. Now, let's kind of review where we are with our practical framework. We've got 3 paths, 5 steps, going from path 1 all the way to path 3. As you go towards path 3, your difficulty level gets greater, okay? So we've talked about how to configure auto event listeners for things like PDFs or link clicks, right? So we've gone through all 5 steps. Now, if we come across a situation in path 1, in step 2, where we're not able to enable a trigger, an out-of-the-box trigger, to see if an interaction is tracked, we then need to move on to path 2 and look at the custom auto event listener path. So we need to go through and explore, can we complete all 5 steps? If we can't, at step 2, test an interaction using a custom auto event listener, we cannot continue on using path 2. We then need to go to path 3, which is relying on our developer. Now, I don't know about everyone on this webinar, but developers are busy people. They're not necessarily going to have the bandwidth or the time to implement custom tracking. So if at all possible, you can try to avoid going to your developer, but in certain cases, you need to go to your developer. Now, the third path here is going through step 1, which is getting your developer or using a CMS plugin to push data to the data layer. Now, the challenge here is everyone's website is different. Everyone's CMS is different. So how you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to figure this out or work with your developer to figure it out. Okay. Your mileage is going to vary depending on your developer's skill set, depending on the flexibility of your CMS. If you're using an old CMS, you're likely going to have a lot of issues here on path 3. Okay. Now, let's say, for example, you are successful in having your developer push data to the data layer. Well, step 2 is going to be you test your data layer code in debug mode in your TMS. Once you've done that, you're going to configure a data layer in step 3. Then you're going to configure a trigger for a custom event. And then you're going to configure a tag and a link to that trigger. So same conceptual process as path 1 and path 2. There's just nuance around how you're going to get your data into the data layer. So that's the challenging part of path 3. It's nothing we, the DAP team, can tell you how to do. It's going to be totally dependent on your CMS, your development team. That's what makes this challenging. So having said all that, what does a data layer push look like? So how do we send data to the data layer? Well, there is a function called data layer push. You'll see this in green here. So you can send things, for example, like login status, like if somebody's not logged in or if they're logged in, or number of customer transactions, or the account start date, right? There's a whole lot of really custom data about an interaction that you can have dynamically inserted to your page by your developer or plugin. So I'll give you an example. You typically think of, or you typically see with a lot of e-commerce stores like Amazon or anywhere where you purchase something, their development team is pushing data about that transaction. So how many items you're buying, what the item cost is per unit. What is the tax? What's the sales tax? How many items did you have in your basket? Those types of pieces of data are routinely pushed to the data layer. Now, getting into that kind of level of granularity, that has to be a job by your developer. So this is where the complexity comes in with path 3. You need to have an understanding of the data layer by your developer, what you're trying to push into the data layer, and understand why you even want to do that in the first place. And then you're going to have to go through the 5 steps to configure your TMS to capture tags, triggers, variables about a specific piece of information or interaction. Now, let's look at a real world example, USPS.com. So USPS.com actually does have some really interesting data layer e-commerce data. So you'll see here a screenshot of where I have added a book of stamps, book of 20 US flag stamps to my cart, right? In the same way I would add something to my cart on Amazon.com or any e-commerce store. When I look at the source code of my page, of my HTML in my shopping cart, this is what I see. So I see a login status, not logged in, account type, guest. I've been assigned a customer ID. I've got customer transactions equals 0. I haven't bought anything yet, right? It's denoting here that I'm in the shopping cart. It's capturing what section of the USPS website I'm on, which is the store. It tells me my e-commerce product data. So it's capturing US flag, book of 20 stamps. See, that's pretty cool stuff. And it's also capturing the price, right? And then it's letting me know, is it in stock, right? It's capturing whether an item is in stock and the quantity that I'm about to purchase. So this is the type of data and the complexity with which you can get really fancy in your data layer using your developer. Now, what needs to go into your data layer is going to really depend on what you're trying to track and why. And how you figure that out, your goals and KPIs. All right. It's nothing we can tell you what to do, that you have to be the ones to figure out what that is. Now, for more on this approach, Tim did a great overview on this in part 1, where he looks at USA.gov's data layer. He looks at USPS.com's data layer. So I would highly encourage you, again, another plug, to go through part 1, review that, and make sure that you feel comfortable with that. Now, more than likely, you can, your path of least resistance is going to be path number 1, not path number 3, right? So start small with path 1, then work up to path 2, and then up to path 3 with your data layer tutorials. Now, couple takeaways, and want to make sure that we try to get some questions in here. I think we're going to be able to do that. Figuring out how to configure a TMS is really challenging, as we've just seen here, right? You have those 3 paths, you have 5 steps. I'm sure some folks here feel a little dizzy just thinking about how you actually need to do that. Use our 3-path configuration framework as a practical way to think about this, right? You're going to get the deck after today's session. Follow that framework. Test out and learn your TMS using that framework to see what works and what doesn't. That's the best way that you're going to learn any type of TMS or Google Tag Manager. Path 1 is the easiest, and it's the path of least resistance for most people. Start with path 1. Never try to make your analytics more difficult than it needs to be. Find the most elegant, simple solution possible when you're getting up to speed with TMSs. Paths 2 and 3, as we saw today, require significantly more thought and development work. You'll notice I did not walk through all 5 steps with the data layer. There's a reason for that. It is very complicated, okay? Try to avoid going to path 3 if at all possible. Try to handle capturing your user interactions using path 1 or possibly path 2. Most importantly, choose your path wisely, okay? Your mileage is going to vary depending on your website technology and your CMS, and depending on how you're able to implement your TMS, okay? Most importantly, choose your path wisely as you get up to speed on your TMS. Now, we do have some time for some questions. As always, please reach out to us with any questions at the DAP support desks at dap@support.digitalgov.gov. I want to include some helpful links that I really enjoy and appreciate. Simo Ahava's website and Analytics Mania. Lots of great material there. So I would highly encourage folks to check out those sites as you're getting up to speed on TMSs. We definitely are inspired and use material for the DAP team to learn about this. So we highly encourage folks to explore those resources. So we're including links to those as well. So let me get back to questions. So Tim, how are we doing with questions in the chat window?
Well, there is one, but I think folks were mostly just, in awe of all of that incredible content that you just delivered. So thank you for doing that. Freddie, I think you win the award for most content covered in under 50 minutes. That was impressive. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So the one question that I was able to do a little research on as you finished the webinar here was we had a specific question about a case where someone said, if I wanted to track how many people subscribe by putting their email address and clicking subscribe on a pop-up overlay splash screen, can I use the page view DOM ready trigger? And so you can take a stab at that. I'll let you know that I've already kind of done some Googling, and I have a resource that I'll drop in the chat as well, and I'll add on to whatever you say.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great question. So really important question. I would kick it back to the user and basically say, we would have to take a look at that pop-up overlay to see what the technology looks like, right? We need to understand, are there attributes or is there information in the data layer showing up under DOM ready or under window loaded, right? So you could use either DOM ready or window loaded, but we'd really have to take a look at what is actually firing in debug mode in your TMS to see what is actually being captured or what's available to us. So again, it's always going to be custom to the technology that you are using. So off the top of my head, in theory, you'd use DOM ready or window loaded, but until we actually see the technology in practice, it's going to be really difficult for us to give you a definitive answer. Tim, I don't know if you found any other insights there, but happy to hear any of those.
Well, I certainly agree with you that without seeing it, I couldn't know if it was necessarily like a form field that they were looking to track, or potentially if it's like just a button. I think there is potential that you could use path 1 and do an auto event tracker and use a button click submit as a trigger. I also included, and this is just a blog that I just found right now, just Googling, but in the chat, I included a blog to implement the form submission trigger that's available by default in Google Tag Manager. And it was from an organization called Measure School. I can't vouch for how good that is, but it looked like a decent tutorial to walk you through tracking form submissions. So it might be possible with that as well. I think I agree with you, Freddie. I mean, it's definitely possible. It's probably possible in one of the more easy paths, given the options that Google gives you by, you could have a button ID or something that you're tracking with. Next question that we had come in. Currently using Google Universal Analytics and still looking to implement GTM. Do you know if this same process of thinking about tags, triggers, and events will work with implementing the next gen Google Analytics 4? That's a great question. Freddie, can I take this one?
Yeah, go for it.
So we get a lot of questions about Google Analytics 4. I know that there's some apprehension about what it's going to mean. I think that by and large, nobody really knows exactly how the tool will end up. We're told by the folks that are Google partners that work with us that Google is continuously making changes and the tool is still in beta. So nothing's really set in stone. But the one thing that I can tell you that seems like it's going to stay is that the way that Google Analytics works currently with the sort of scope of user, session, and page view. And we've had webinars in the past on how you can't mix certain metrics and dimensions because they're based on different scope. They're both based on a user scope or a session scope and a page view scope. That is all going to be blown away. And basically, the way I understand how GA4 is going to work is that more or less everything will be recorded as an event. It will be an event that happens to be a page view, or an event that happens to be a link click, or an event that happens to be a session start, or something like that. But it's going to flatten the sort of hierarchy of scope of the metrics and dimensions that we're used to. So I would imagine that some of this will change a little in GTM, but really for most of the purposes that Freddie talked about today, it's probably going to be, I would think, don't quote me on this, but I would think it's going to be the same. Because really, Freddie was talking about doing things that were very specific to events. And because GA4 is going to heavily focus on events, yeah, it seems like it would be the same there.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tim.
This is an interesting one. We had if you know any resources to translate this approach more specifically to Adobe Analytics, please share. That's something maybe we could look for, Freddie.
Yeah, it depends on, yeah, I guess, we could look for that. Yeah, it depends on if you're trying to use Adobe's TMS or you're trying to use a different TMS with Adobe Analytics. So there's some questions in there. I would encourage the person who is asking that to please shoot us a note at the email address on the screen, and we'll be happy to do a little research on that.
Yeah, I know, obviously, as Freddie mentioned, we happen to use GTM, so we show it. That's the examples that we have, but I do know that Adobe's TMS is called Launch, and I know there aren't a ton of agencies in the US government that I know that are using Adobe right now, but there are a few. And that question was from Francine. Francine, if you want to reach out to us, I can put you in touch with maybe some other folks that are using Adobe, and maybe we can find an answer for you. Okay, any other questions? Looks like that's it. All right, Freddie, back to you to wrap it up.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for attending today's webinar. It was a pleasure putting this material together. We would highly encourage folks, please give us your feedback to the survey that comes out. You'll be receiving the deck and a link to the video once it's posted to your email addresses. So be on the lookout for that. Want to give big thanks to Tim for his feedback on this webinar to me, and also a big thank you to the Digital.gov team for their support. And we look forward to meeting with the DAP community at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.